I think in the next 10 years, AI is going to allow us to provide government services in a really wholly different way that maybe will help change the perception of the public of what we can achieve. But the public is often confused about what level of government does what thing in government, right? There's a problem with something in government. Is that a federal thing that broke? Is that a local thing that broke? Is that a state thing that broke? And most of them don't want to know what level that is. They just want the thing fixed.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. This week's episode explores how the role of state government is changing and what that means in practice for policy, budgeting, and public service delivery. Our guests today are two nationally recognized experts in state governance and public administration. Carol Weissert is Professor Emerita of Political Science at Florida State University. Before her retirement in 2021, she was Leroy Collins Eminent Scholar and Professor of Political Science and Director of the Leroy Collins Institute. Jonathan Womer is the Director of the Department of Administration for the state of Rhode Island, where he is leading all state administrative functions and making data-informed decisions to enhance the public good while preserving fiscal responsibility. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carol and Jonathan, as usual, let's begin with a broad view. How would you describe the most significant shift in the role of state government over the past year? And maybe, Carol, we can start with you, and then Jonathan, you can share your thoughts as well.
There have been many shifts, but a number of those shifts were in place before the last year. The partisanship, the disregard of state sovereignty, the domination of national issues for state elections, all those things have been happening over the past few years, sometimes 10 years. But what's really happening is that we've seen an acceleration of those things, more partisanship, kind of stepping on the states more, state sovereignty more, and the domination of national issues. I think the two issues we'll talk most about that I worry about most are the midterm redistricting. That's a very, very partisan act that is being imposed, and states are going along with it. And then the second issue, of course, is the issue of troops coming into cities with the governor of the state saying, no, we don't want this. So that really clear disregard for state sovereignty in the last few months, that really sort of stepped up a lot of those issues in my mind.
I think I'd add, a couple of things on the more operational level, since that's really the perspective I can contribute to. We've seen a lot in the last year of a difficulty getting answers from the federal government, right? So, about a third of the money that states have comes from the federal government. And, with layoffs and with transitions about programs where the federal government has said they're gone, no, they're not gone, the courts reinstate them. I have a lot of our federal contacts that are difficult for us to talk to now. We try to call them on the phone, you ask for information. And, they say things like, we can't talk to you. We don't know the answers ourselves. And that makes it hard to run things, right? The feds provide, as I said, about a third of our money. But in addition to that, they provide a lot of rules and regulations we have to follow to get that money. And if we don't have that clear communication, it can make it really difficult to run operations.
Carol, you mentioned this has been happening prior to just this year. But why does it feel so different? And why haven't leaders said more or done more in the past?
We have red states and blue states. Certainly, they've been moving in these directions for a long time. But we haven't had this kind of thing where the president says, well, I want more Republicans in the legislature, in the Congress, and I want you to redistrict, even if it's only one seat. This mid-decade redistricting just is unbelievable to me, really unheard of. We're talking about that in Florida, just to pick up one seat. And then, of course, you're having California fighting Texas, which is, again, we're seeing more and more of that. It's based on partisanship. Years ago, I worked for the National Governors Association, and those governors, they've always been partisan. I mean, you don't get to be governor if you're a kind of a good, non-partisan person. But, they could sit down together and they could talk together. And we used to do training sessions for new governors, and they would talk frankly about, here's what you really need to do, And I don't see that happening now. And my understanding is the NGA has had is having some real problems keeping its members because Democrats and Republicans don't think it's doing the right thing. And this is really, as he said, this is new. We don't care if you're a state and you have sovereignty. We need another person in the Congress, so we'll have a majority. And that kind of thing it just seems to me is extremely harmful for states and the country, frankly.
States are increasingly stepping into areas once dominated by the federal government. How have you seen this play out in practice? And how have areas like healthcare, infrastructure, and climate policy been affected, if at all?
I'll start with healthcare and social services because, states traditionally have been the operational arm of most of that, right? The federal government, gives hundreds of millions of dollars to individual states, billions of dollars in many cases, but they let the states run these things. SNAP, TANF, and Medicaid, being the large ones. And over the last couple of years, there's been a big push from the academy and other places on program performance. And how are we really affecting the outcomes for individuals around those areas? But the federal government gives us this in really pretty distinct stovepipes. And it is often really difficult then to treat the person that cuts across those stovepipes when we get the funding and the rules really dedicated by individual federal agencies. So the rise of performance has really been hampered, I think, by the stovepiping of the federal government. Now, maybe there's some possibility with the changes coming here that we get less of those stovepipes out of the federal government here in the long run. They're cutting staff, they're reducing benefits. I mean, in the long run, that could mean that the states step in and take much more of a role, and we turn more to a block grant system in the long run, which would enable states to cut across those stovepipes more effectively. But it's probably too early to tell where this is all going to land.
Jonathan, you provided good background context on some of the challenges. Let's talk about the innovations, though. What innovations are emerging in how states manage performance, data, and service delivery?
I mean, it's really pretty exciting from that front. Like, we are getting to the point now where most states have many of our major business processes automated, right? There's like really full-on, fairly modern computer systems that do this, which is providing a lot of administrative data. And that administrative data in some places has been looked at and combined and analyzed to help provide innovations and better performance. I mean, there's some areas that are being able to use predictive analytics now to say, hey, you as a citizen have had a really traumatic or important life event, and those life events are associated now with these certain outcomes or options, and we'd like to step in and give you possibilities. So it's no longer simply a discussion of you're this kind of person, you get this kind of money. It's you've had these experiences. How can we help you to achieve a better life going forward? And of course, with AI, that is going to become much more intense. Now, I would say there's a flip side to this, right? Which is that the public is becoming more demanding in these areas, right? They're seeing what's happening in the economy. They're seeing what's happening with corporate interactions, and they're expecting that out of their government. So there's two sides to that coin.
Carol, you've probably seen quite a bit of innovation yourself, but you've also written extensively about intergovernmental relations. How are states navigating their relationships with federal agencies, especially when federal priorities shift dramatically between administrations?
Well, there used to be something in political science, called the picket fence federalism. And that was basically you had the federal officials and then the state officials, and sometimes you had the local officials, and they really worked together. They were all experts and they could all kind of work together on this. And Jonathan can speak to this more personally, but my sense is too that there's a lot less of that. And part of it, I think too, is this, one of the things I'm concerned about is this questioning of expertise. It used to be that state officials and federal officials were the experts in building highways or handling healthcare or running elections. But now in a lot of states, the legislators don't really trust the bureaucracy anymore. They don't trust public officials anymore, and they really question their expertise. So I think the expertise issue is a real critical one for public administration. It used to be that these guys could put on their nonpartisan hats, work together because they understood, they talked the same language. But now I don't get a sense that that's going on. And the second thing in terms of federalism is the horizontal working of across the states. It used to be that Rhode Island would get a good idea and Kentucky would adopt it and then Florida would adopt it. And what we see now across the states is that there are these national interest groups that have their model state legislation that they are pushing. And somehow they've replaced a lot of this. I'll call Jonathan in Rhode Island because I know he did it. But instead, these interest groups are saying, well, here's a model bill. Here, it worked in California, so why don't you try it? I just see a problem in terms of the vertical expertise and also the horizontal expertise that I just don't see this sort of diffusion from the laboratories of democracy, as we called it. I don't see that anymore. And whether it could go back, but it just seems to me that both of those relationships are really suffering. And part of it is, again, partisanship, but part of it is this kind of questioning about experts. I've got my experts, you've got your experts, and that worries me.
I'd agree with you fundamentally. I think, though, some of it does have to do with, the public and the public's trust in government, right? Because there's, in that we've created, unfortunately, a vacuum that now is kind of getting filled with other things. I think part of that also has to do with the internet, right? Like we've undoubtedly nationalized some issues. Just it's easier for an individual in a particular state or community to see things nationally in a way that they couldn't see them nationally before. So that combination has been difficult. I really am quite hopeful that we can do some things we've never been able to do before, like in Rhode Island and a couple of other places, taking data across a lot of our administrative silos. I think in the next 10 years and combining that with AI is going to allow us to provide government services in a really wholly different way that maybe will help change the perception of the public of what we can achieve. But the public is often confused about what level of government does what thing in government, right? There's a problem with something in government. Is that a federal thing that broke? Is that a local thing that broke? Is that a state thing that broke? And most of them don't want to know what level that is. They just want the thing fixed. And so anytime we have levels of government more or less at war with each other, right? And when the roles are completely being questioned between those, then no one knows what lane to be in. It's hard to work together. I will also put on the note that, with the federal government shedding so many jobs, it's been a boon for us in hiring. So we are actually getting like experts. We've hired many IRS agents, right? We've, hired people from EPA. We've hired people from HHS, and we are grateful for that. But I certainly am worried for the expertise and working with our federal partners, because that's become more difficult as many more experts have left.
Let's talk a little bit more about the public. Like, how are citizens experiencing some of these changes, and what might be their expectations? And are the different levels of government meeting those expectations?
Well, this trust issue is interesting because it's one that this is not a new issue. I went back and looked at some of the data on, what governmental level you trust. They trust the local level the most, and then the states, and then the feds. But the numbers are not substantially different in recent years. They really have started tanking, and now they've kind of evened off. But what you are finding is that it depends on the party of the respondent. And this really wasn't the case before. It used to be that you'd say, do you trust the federal government? Come somebody would say, post office, Social Security. Yeah. But now they think whatever party is in control. And what you find is that when the Democrats had the presidency, and then more Democrats trusted the federal government, the Republicans didn't, and then vice versa. And that just flummoxes me, right? And so the idea of trust now, I don't know what it means. I really think that we don't know what trust is anymore, because it relates to whatever party I am and whatever party controls the government. So I think maybe we have to come up with something a little better, because I don't think trust is working anymore.
Jonathan, how do we build trust back?
I think being effective. And one of the difficulties right now are a lot of our problems are national. There's the discussion of the abundance agenda. How do we build better transportation networks? How do we deal with climate change? The pandemic is sort of an example. There are plenty of things that cut across individual states and individual states' no matter how great that your DMV experience is or your SNAP benefits are easy to use, some of those things are fundamentally going to have to be at the national level for people to feel like government fully is working. So in the end, we're going to have to do some stepping back and looking. I think the one thing about this administration that I think is worth talking about in the long run is the thought that many of our current processes haven't been terribly responsive to the needs of the public in some areas. And obviously, we need to do that in a way that's structured, and we need to do that in a way that brings everyone aboard together. But fundamentally, I do think there are some real challenges that government has had in delivery of some of the larger purposes that it has domestically. And we've generally failed at that. And, just because, we could mow down neighborhoods, in the 1960s and 70s to put up a transportation network doesn't mean that's the way we should be doing it today. But at the same time, why don't we have high-speed rail relative to every other, modern economy in the world? Why does it take us so long to build things? Why is it so expensive to build things relative to those same places? We can take a hard look at regulatory policy, jurisdiction policy, and see if we can craft some better ways of delivering some of these really core infrastructures.
Government generally works better when well-funded. And we've heard Carol say states provide most of the services. Of course, they also receive some federal funding to do that. And that there's going to be an expectation going forward that there's going to be less federal dollars to be spent. How are the states adapting their fiscal strategies to meet these new demands, especially with federal funding becoming more conditional or uncertain than it has been in the past?
That's really important. And just to sort of set a little bit of a baseline, unlike the federal government, all the states, except maybe Vermont, have balanced budget requirements. We are in the business of, only spending what we can bring in and have. These balanced budget requirements make us look really hard at our budgets every year. And with states, about a third of our expenses are healthcare, right? Between the Medicaid program that provides medical services for low income and our own state employees. And the growth rate on that is, as you can imagine, pretty astronomical, while the average state, revenue growth can't keep up with it. So the average state has to constantly be thinking about, what can I reinvent? What can I cut? What can I change? Because I've got to deal with these healthcare increases every year. Some states are growing at a higher pace than other states and have that less of a pressure. But on average, that pressure is real and very much existing. They're looking at ways to reduce the number of operations they have in certain areas, but to be more efficient and to be constantly be reinventing is the common way to deal with it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in the long run, if the federal government continues to cut back staff in the thousands and hundreds of thousands, if they continue to cut benefits and a lot of these grants coming to the individual states, I think states are going to feel a lot of pressure to fill some of that void on their own. And depending on their situation, they'll have to think up some new revenue sources to do it.
Carol, budgets typically drive policy or operations and services. What might this mean for state legislators or governors? Are we seeing changes in how power is distributed or exercised within state governments in this new budget environment?
I've done a little bit of the work on this, particularly looking during COVID to see who was, making these decisions. And clearly it was the governors who are doing the executive orders, and the legislature sort of took a back seat. But then also, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing more legislators getting into the details of policy. My perception is that the elected officials are making more decisions and trying to be more engaged in policy rather than sort of saying, okay, well, we're going to do this and we'll turn it over to the people who really know how to do this. But they're actually doing a lot of this. Again, some of this relates back to this role of expertise and how they're getting a lot of their information from other people, not necessarily the staffs. But I think there might be, in my view, I would almost call it a shift between elected officials and non-elected officials.
We've been really talking about a changing environment. Jonathan, what advice would you give to state leaders trying to navigate this evolving landscape? What should they prioritize? What should they be thinking to build long-term resilience and effectiveness?
it's really concentrating on having a resilient staff. When you think about managing through crises, you need people that are adaptable and that can think on their feet and can move with a changing environment. And if you really concentrate too much on hiring staff that is oriented to a particular problem at the moment and not holistically enough, then it's hard to be adaptive. At the end of the day, having really great people around you is really meaningful. And that goes in the long run to really thinking about your HR policies and thinking about your compensation and making sure you're staying with the market. Because if you're not, you're going to run into problems in operations and then delivering those services and finally policymaking.
Data drives a lot of our decision making, and federal government certainly has its database, and state and local governments have theirs, and sometimes they interact and sometimes they don't. What are your thoughts on how data is being used, how it can inform decision making and changes that are being made at the federal or state level?
Data has really the ability to really target programs to make them more effective, especially cutting across silos and looking at people as individuals that might use multiple social service programs. It can also do a lot in the area of fraud, waste, and abuse, and a lot of states have looked into that. Relatively recently, the federal government put out an executive order asking states to provide a lot of their data to the federal government to, from their perspective, root out waste, fraud, and abuse. I was a little disappointed in that executive order. While I think, that's certainly a laudable goal, because states are the operational arms and they operate a lot of those programs in very different ways from other states. I think it's going to be very difficult for the federal government to pull off. I really would have wished that they had focused on individual states running their own integrated systems to look at fraud, and they could have mandated that to states and then audited that practice. I think that would have been far more effective.
Carol, you mentioned at the beginning that although this certainly feels a certain way and that there's a lot of things changing, it's not necessarily new. What are some of the most important lessons we could learn from the past, and what do you think we should all expect for the future?
And one of the things we haven't mentioned that I wanted to mention was elections, because that to me is an area where we're getting federal overreach to states, where there's an effort to put together a national data set of voters. And that has long been kind of a state issue. The federal government's demanded information from the states, and they haven't given them, and they're now being sued. The states, 6 states are being sued. But maybe we learn from elections, right? That's all I'm saying. That maybe we say, wait a minute, the Constitution says this is the state responsibility. We are carrying on the state responsibility. And we've learned a little bit about that from the past on elections, because you did see state officials stand up to efforts to try to get into the systems when they really didn't belong. So maybe we have learned a little bit from that, and kind of a system that's a step too far. It's hard for me to really figure out how, when you get a situation like a president sending in troops against the governor's dismissal, maybe the states will get together and the states will say, I saw that, the Oklahoma governor is standing up to this. So I actually think if indeed we come out of this anytime soon, or maybe in the long run, I think the states are going to play a big role in that. I really do, because I think the states have this longstanding responsibility. They're capable, as Jonathan has said, and I think that they're going to say at some point, you know what, this is not working, and this is how we're going to do it. I think the states are going to save the day.
There's a lot of change that's happening within our broader landscape, and states certainly have a role to play. Thank you both for joining us today. Your insights are invaluable as we explore how state governments are evolving to meet changing needs and how they're also responding to a changing federal environment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.